Welcome to the latest episode of Rounds Rant, and today I'm joined by Tim Butcher. Tim Butcher is an English journalist, broadcaster, and author. He is the author of Blood River, Chasing the Devil, and The Trigger. Tim also spent time as a journalist between 1990 and 2009 working for the Daily Telegraph newspaper. So to begin this episode, I'd just like to ask you, how are you today, Tim?
Oh, I'm very well. You speak to me in Cape Town, South Africa, which is where I live and have lived for a number of years, and I feel very blessed to be here when Northern Europe is being ravaged by the beast from the east, and you're dealing with terrible weather, so we're very smug down here. Mind you, of course, the other side of the coin is that Cape Town is currently very dry. You might have read about it, you might be aware that it's the first city in the world that's threatened with actually turning the mains water off with that low. The reservoirs are that low, so we're all a bit smelly here. We haven't had a shower for a few days.
Yeah, well, we're both suffering in our own ways. My first question to you is about your early days on this planet, so to say, and what were your standout memories of your upbringing?
British, Midlands, solid, average, 1970s and bleak. I say average because I come from a middle-class background, accountant dad, mum who used to work and then gave it up when she had 3 kids. Back in the day, without supermarkets, without everyone owning a car, it was a case of going to 16 different shops every day to buy your bread, your vegetables, your meat, your whatever. And mum did that. And the 70s, I think, in Britain were a fairly bleak time. And if you're from the Midlands, and I'm right from the middle of the UK, right slap in the middle, as far from the sea as it's possible to get, I don't know, maybe you get a bit of an itch, maybe you get a bit of a desire to travel. So what's my first memory? I guess my first memory is, going outside, going for a walk, going over the horizon, finding a ditch to climb in or a tree to explore. So I guess those are my dominant childhood memories. getting down that muddy lane and going for a wander.
Nice. And you studied where? You went to college in Oxford, and I'm curious to know, what did you study there? Was it journalism kind of course? Or
No,
was it different?
I did the Waffler's degree, politics, philosophy, and economics. They sound quite grand together, but really it's just an excuse to read contemporary books about how the world works and try and understand it. Not saying that one ever did, but it's strange. At the time I looked around, I was 18, 19, 20 in those years, and I looked around and I just saw some pimply 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. Well, those people are now running Britain, as far as I could tell. David Cameron did this degree, PPE. The Miliband brothers both did PPE. Yvette Cooper did PPE. So these British politicians on the other side of the Irish Sea seem to be dominated by this bunch of people. So it's a course offered by Oxford. It's a general degree, and it's a fun degree because it has a huge amount of freedom. And as I say, you get to look at the processes and the issues by which our world is run. Not to say our world is understood, because I don't think many people do fully understand it. But those are the kind of that's the framing. So it's a fun degree. I struggled a bit. I wasn't a standout brilliant student by any means, but there were areas that I loved, areas I didn't get on with so well. And Oxford is a funny place because it is very, very entitled. A lot of people there think that they're owed things, and that's a strange attitude to have when you're 19. No one owes me anything. Got to go out and earn it. But some people did. It's a funny place, and I wasn't particularly comfortable there. But that was all a long time ago. Crumbs, it was in the last century.
So how did you end up eventually getting into the journalist world with the Daily Telegraph? Did you go into a more political-esque job following out of college, or did you go straight into journalism?
Well, segueing back a little bit, I'd always wanted to look over the horizon, always loved travel, always liked the idea of better understanding things by comparing what we've got with what others have to try and understand. And I considered 2 careers actually, both with kind of foreign in them, correspondent, being a journalist, but a foreign correspondent, and the Foreign Office, being a diplomat. I did try that route, but it choked me slightly because suddenly you are, being in the Foreign Office, it's an exercise not in being an individual, but being in a committee and accepting what the committee says, accepting what, the chairman says and guides and all the rest, rather than, going up by yourself. And that didn't work. Tried it, did the exam, got a place, but didn't feel right. And the journalism thing was was a better fit, and better. It felt right. You're dealing with words, you're dealing with ideas, you're dealing with interesting people, odd people, quirky people, misfits and strangers, and doing all sorts of strange things. And also, you've got to be versatile. I did start in a local paper in Bromsgrove, and then the first story I wrote was literally about something in the high street in a town called Bromsgrove, south and west of Birmingham. True local paper stuff, but very important to a local paper because, if you get it wrong, the person who is being slighted, you're going to bump into him in the high street. He's out there. He's going to be in the bus queue. He's going to be in the pub. He's there. Whereas if it's in a national newspaper, you're kind of one stage removed. The local paper is a great challenge because if you make a boo-boo, someone, comes and, stabs their finger in your chest and says, "How dare you say that? What did you mean by that?" So I wasn't there long, but long enough, and I felt I learnt, and I got a place at the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, back in the day, last century, when it was a newspaper that sold 1 million copies. Now it sells 300 odd thousand. So it's a fragment, a fraction of what it used to be. And things have changed in journalism, but back then they still had a budget for what were called foreign correspondents, which are people who, when international events happen, they would fund you, they would pay you to go to those difficult places at difficult times and to better understand them. It's the oldest premise in the book. If you're going to make a judgment about something in a foreign land, you got to have some sort of informed opinion. And foreign correspondents, they're not perfect by any means. They are, as the old cliche goes, they write the first draft of history. It's not going to be the final received one, but they actually have they sketch it out. And I was very lucky to see some epic events, and also at the same time, Daily Telegraph, I did all sorts of things. Car crashes on the M4 in the fog. And one of my highlights was meeting some friends in a bar one night, and they said, "Oh, how was it going?" And I sort of blushed a bit and sort of changed the subject a bit too obviously. And a friend said, "What are you talking about?" What did I say? He grabbed the paper and he opened it, page 3 of the Daily Telegraph. Tim Butcher had done a big report on the most expensive teddy bear ever sold at auction. So I became teddy bear correspondent amongst my drinking buddies for many a while. So journalism has a nice grounding effect. You can be talking to a president one day and auctioning a teddy bear the next. So if you get in the airs and graces, you can have that bubble burst quite quickly.
What are some of the noticeable changes in journalism from when you started writing for the Telegraph to what it is like today?
Well, I think there's only one word, really. There's one massive, colossal change, and that is a thing called the internet. The internet changes everything. Newspapers worked on a very clear and strict model, and the newspaper owners and newspaper infrastructure had an advantage. And the advantage was, I can distribute things to you. I can get that news to you. So a newspaper, whether it was the Daily Mail, Daily Express, or an Irish newspaper, American newspaper, French newspaper, whatever, people obsess slightly on the content, the journalism that went into it. But really their unique selling point was that they could actually get the thing to the reader from central London with the trains. You could deliver newspaper from Cornwall to Fort William, from Wales to the Wash, and any person at 7 o'clock in the morning is reading the same thing. So you've got to control that distribution. So if you get it into the newspaper, it reaches people. If it doesn't get to the newspaper, it doesn't. It's silent. It's lost. And that all changes in 94, 95, 96, because suddenly everyone's got the internet from Cornwall to Fort William, from the Wash to Wales. You don't need to wait for the newspaper to arrive by truck, by railway, by la. You could get it another way. And that's been the colossal change. So the newspapers that had that control over the news that was distributed, they could edit, choose, select, prioritize, have their political values went into the choice of news articles, all of those sorts of things. That has gone because the internet has passed it. You don't have that unique selling point of newspapers, which is the control of distribution, has gone. And with it has eroded so many things. So you don't have the control, you don't have the income because people are not paying for the newspaper anymore. Therefore, that stream of income hemorrhages away. And if you don't have income coming to the newspaper, they can't pay for a correspondent to go and find things out. So the impact of the internet is that there's no longer a budget to go and send professional journalists out. Why do you not need professional journalists? Because you've got other sources. You've got unchecked PR machines. You've got citizen journalists. Everyone with a cell phone becomes a journalist. Well, that's great, marvelous. That contributes, but that's not, they're not the same as a professional writer or professional journalist. And we can mock and scoff, and you're quite right to. Journalists are not saints by any means. There's plenty of rogues and cads amongst them. We all know that for a truth. But the other truth is this: that you mustn't judge all journalists by the awful behaviour of a Sun reporter who might do this, or a terrible headline writer, screeching headline from the Daily Mail. Don't taint us all with that single brush. As I know a lot of very, very hard-working people, and decent people. I also know a lot of people who made literally the ultimate sacrifice, who gave their lives, who were killed in the Balkans, in Africa, elsewhere in the Middle East, who gave their lives because they cared to try and find stuff out. So I get a bit, I get a bit jaded with the people who say, "Oh, journalists, you're a bunch of this, you're a bunch of that." Yeah, sure, there's some bad ones amongst the tribe, but what's changed now is that quality, that filter, which used to be there because there was a grumpy line of editors and, sub-editors with cigarettes hanging from their bottom lips and curmudgeonly old grumps who cared about the devil in the detail and all of that sort of thing. In the Daily Telegraph back in the day, they used to have this incredibly strong rule. You only ever mention the pound sterling. You then put in brackets the foreign currency. You never did it the other way around. Okay, so that's the rule. So when someone quipped in Hollywood, "Oh, Liz Taylor, she's worth $1 million," the Daily Telegraph headline was, "Liz Taylor, she's worth £323,000, 176 and 26p, open brackets, $1 million." That's how kind of curmudgeonly these people were. They're obsessed with detail. And I think it's great because, more all credit to them. These guys were absolute genius at staying calm when the Berlin Wall was coming down, when political turmoil was happening, when a bomb was going off. I've seen people deal with bomb situations. I've seen people deal with fatalities. A journalist, one of their friends getting killed and staying calm and reporting it calmly and accurately and thoroughly. And it's really a very, very impressive thing to see. That sort of calmness. It's gone now because you don't have the resources. The resources are gone because the internet means that no one will pay the cover price for the paper, but more importantly, that advertising revenue. All those big lavish advertisers who come and, Rover Motor Car Company or Land Rover would say, take slabs of advertising out in a broadsheet newspaper. And if you're reaching 1 million, if you've got 1 million sales, you've got a huge premium for your advertising revenue. If you're down to 300,000 sales, it's hemorrhaging away. So your income's down, and if your income's down, you can't pay for journalists. And it's a self-supporting thing, because if you then pay peanuts, you get monkeys.
Yeah, exactly. So with what you said, do you think gatekeeping and the role of editors have been completely got rid of with social media, or do you still think there is a gatekeeper there making sure that the right information is given out to the public? Or do we actually live in a society where fake news is pretty much the only news we're reading?
Well, I think one follows from the other, that the filters, the editor levels, the people, the eyes who are on stories checking things, of which there used to be several, have been pared back to a bare minimum. I think there's still some, 1 or 2, but there used to be 12 or 15. Now they've gone. So what does that mean? That means you've got 1 or 2, and into that environment, then fake news can drip. Because the internet, of course, is not driven by accuracy. It's driven by extremes. It's driven by shock. It's driven by the outlier stories on the edge of the bell curve, not the normality, not what's real in the middle of the bell curve, because they're boring. We need clickbait. You need the woman with the triple D breasts. You need the academic who's got the 15 degrees, who's been caught doing something odd. You've got to have the sportsman doing these things. Clickbait is an extraordinary thing, because sadly, clickbait works because people are interested. They do want to click on the picture of the freak. What is it? Someone joked that the internet was all about freaks, Armageddon, and porn. And if you can get the 3 together in one story, you'll break the internet. Well, doesn't Kim Kardashian do that? When her her backside spills out of another. She deliberately photographs herself spilling out of a very tight leotard, leaning over with her backside and making some reference to family values in America. I mean, that really is the holy trinity of the internet coming together. So the internet's a very powerful thing. For me, it's powerful because it's like having a library. I can look over the shoulder of others and reach the expertise and skills of anyone, anytime. But when it comes to the news industry, it's been very, very dangerous. And we have a situation where, a US president is elected, and it can be feasibly argued that the marginal cause, the marginal difference that made him elected was people who voted because they believed a narrative which was deliberately falsely planted, whether it was the stories that Hillary Clinton, there were website stories on funny websites that said Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring in a pizza house in Chevy Chase in Virginia. It's there it is. And when the New York Times then has to report Hillary Clinton denied running a blah, 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 because they have to do it in that rather sort of strange way, that almost odd way of the media, we don't actually have the integrity to say, well, that's just such absolute outlandish bullshit. We ignore it. They say, oh, we've got to actually give it the fair benefit of the doubt. We've got to go and speak to the Clinton camp about that, get them to issue a denial. And then by issuing a denial, you legitimize the bull. And around that grain of bullshit enamels a few layers, and then the layers get more and more enameled until, guess what? The internet's bestrewn with stories like this, half-baked, half-cooked, and influencing people. There are voters who genuinely went to the polls thinking that, Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States of America. Barack Obama is a Muslim. Trump insinuated it. Trump hinted at it. Trump stood on platforms with people who bellowed it out. And by doing that, there are people leaning on the bars in Southside Chicago, in Peoria, in wherever, people who will vote, who have a vote, legitimate contributors to the electoral cycle, who will say, well, actually, that Obama, he should never have been president because he wasn't even born here, not even one of us. And that's when it gets bloody dangerous.
So to move on to some of your pieces of work, your book, Blood River, was written after you became an African foreign correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And the book follows your mission to recreate the expedition of H.M. Stanley. And what were some of the biggest challenges you faced by recreating that expedition? And also, to follow on from that, how tough of a book was that to write?
I guess that we'll split that into two. I mean, I don't need to tell any Irish person of a certain age, a little bit older than you perhaps, what Congo means. Congo has this unique sense. When the Irish troops went there in the 1960s, they found themselves mired in a situation which was part real and part fantasy, but always dark and not very comic. As you know, many Irish soldiers lost their lives in horrible incidents. The Pont de Niemba, the Niemba Bridge, and the siege of Jadotville recently turned into a film, amongst others. So it's not just for Ireland that Congo occupies this space, for me as well, for many, because if I think of Africa now, I think of Africa's problems, and let's be honest, I know Africa well, and there are many problems here, and they do recur. It's not as if, he's just a grumpy old white racist supremacist being rude about Africa. No, I'm not. I'm being a realist. I've lived through Ebola coming and going into West Africa. I've lived through Mobutu coming and going, being replaced by a dictator, even worse. I've lived through, we just had Robert Mugabe clinging onto power into his night. It is a different continent. And yet at the heart of all of the stories in the Congo, in Africa, I used to find the Congo played a role. It physically is a space in the middle of the continent. It sits astride the equator. It's right there. It's massive. It's a big lump of land. It's named for a river, the River Congo. And it has an extraordinary vice-like grip over history, over the history of Africa. It influences today. It influences the past. And you can be sure as anything, it's going to influence the future. So I, as a correspondent trying to understand this troublesome continent, I found myself being drawn back almost magnetically to one place, the place that was so bad in the 60s for for the Irish soldiers and the UN peacekeeping mission for in the 70s when Rumble in the Jungle was sharing a very distorted view of life in the Congo. Mobutu was being so greedy into the 80s when we start getting the trouble that would come into the 1990s with the genocide because that's connected. The Rwanda genocide is so it all kind of amalgamates. And then I found this extraordinary thing, which I didn't appreciate, that, as you quite rightly say, Henry Morton Stanley was the first outsider to chart the river. And he did so in one of those massive, important Victorian moments of exploration. He'd already done in a previous trip the Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Rift. There had been other travellers. There'd been Mungo Park on the Niger River. You'd had guys at Burton and Speke exploring the upper Nile. But those guys, they were important and they all played a role without a doubt. But the absolute key, the moment, the thing when the key turned in the lock was this journey by Stanley. And the reason it turned in the lock was because having found this river and charted it, suddenly, the white man gets interested in the middle of Africa. We'll take a bit of land there. There's a river there. We could use that for to support a colony. Let's grab some land in the middle. And the Belgian king made his move. Prior to that, the white man had never been interested in Africa. The hinterland, the bit in the middle, the bit in the meat of it. It was only interested in the edge. Those ports, Cape Town, where I am now, Mombasa, Freetown, Libreville, places where you'd be able to resupply ships or do trade. But it never went inside. So Stanley changes everything. He starts the scramble for Africa. And there I was reading about this, and I found something. It was like scales falling from my eyes. I'd never heard of it. Stanley did the strip. He's changed his history. It's a huge thing. But he didn't do it as a scientist or a geographer or as a representative of the British government or as an army officer or as an anything. Richie, he did it as a grubby journalist. He was a journalist sent on this trip. And who sent him? The same newspaper that sent me to Africa, the Daily Telegraph. So he was a Daily Telegraph hack, fiddling his expenses and writing his stories, worrying about where the next bit of money would come from when he went on this trip, 1874 to 1877. Extraordinary to think you could go for 3 years. Going back to our internet thing, internet age, no journalist could go offline for 3 years. He did. And he came back with the story of the late 19th century. It changes everything. So I became obsessed with Stanley, this obscure little Welshman. Came from Wales originally, an illegitimate child had been dumped in a workhouse. He'd rebranded himself. His original name was John Rowlands, a good Welsh name, and he rebrands himself Henry Morton Stanley. And he's a repackaged guy. He literally reinvents himself, which is quite modern, I thought, even though we're in the 19th century, and changes Africa. So I wanted to do this. The problem was, when I started out, even in the 21st century doing this trip, planning it 2000, 2001, 2002, 3 and 4, I was told it's impossible to do it. The country is so riven by war, riven by problems of disease, and riven by terrible logistics. There are no roads left. There are no boats. There are no railways. There's nothing. It's all gone to hell in a handbasket. I couldn't believe that. How could that possibly be? 21st century, a place with no roads, a place with no rail.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. 21st century, the internet's been around for 10 years. I can book a ticket. I can buy a ticket off Everest. I can go to the Sahara. I dive in the deepest seas in the world. I can go to the highest mountains in the Andes. I mean, I can do anything. Sure, I could go to the Congo. Well, you try. You try buying a ticket to go to the Congo. You try finding anyone who, it's just not there. So for my biggest problem was logistics. I was okay to deal with the war. I could manage that. I've done wars before. I've done cross front lines before. I know how to be patient and find the right rebel group and do it at 3 o'clock in the morning when everyone's drunk. And a little bit of tradecraft I knew, but that wasn't going to cut it. A little bit of military foreign correspondent tradecraft was not going to cut the Congo because the scale is so enormous. I was going to go from London to Moscow, that sort of distance. 1,600 miles, 2,800 kilometers.
Not an easy task.
And there are no roads. No roads. Nothing. So anyway, that became a challenge and I became obsessed with it. Cut a long story short, I got a break. A break came with a guy who said, look, we're prepared to take some little motorbikes down where the old roads used to be. They're tiny little motorbikes. We can pick them up and carry them over obstacles. And we'll set off with you. And that was the breaker. That was the deal breaker for me. And we went 700 kilometers through the bush tiny motorbikes, taking every fluid ounce of petrol with us, every bit of water, every bit of food. Couldn't trust it, couldn't rely on anything. No trade, no shops, no can of sardines, no warm can of Coca-Cola, no nothing. And I was very blessed because I fell in with incredible guides, and the journey worked only because of the kindness of strangers. And the book is a full tribute to that. Now, you then asked how difficult, how hard was it to write a book? Well, I'd never written a book. I'd written lots of journalism. I'd written teddy bear auctions. I'd written weather stories. I'd written all sorts of things, but I'd never written a book. But I naively thought, well, what is a book? It's 100,000 words. Well, that's just 100 big stories, isn't it? I mean, I do a 1,000-word piece in an afternoon and 2 hours the afternoon. Some days I'll do 3 or 4 of those. What's wrong with that? That's 100 days' work. Won't be a problem. Big problem. Big difference. And what is the difference with a book? A book is not a piece of journalism. A piece of journalism has that instant hit. It's the froth on the coffee. It's the froth on the cappuccino. It's the thing that's right there, and then it collapses. And tomorrow's, today's newspaper, yesterday's, tomorrow. What am I saying? Today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chip paper. The old cliche. It goes. A book has to have life. It has to be sustainable. And what sustains it? A story worth telling, and a story that lasts, a story that hangs in the air. Joseph Conrad had a nice phrase about writing. He said, the best writing is like the best music. After the music has gone, the refrain hangs in the air and stays in your ear. The best writing is the same. And what gives it that power to last? A narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, an end, a direction, a flow. And I had done the journey. I felt I had a book there, but many people say the words, I'm going to write a book. Very, very few of them fulfill that sentence.
Was there ever a time throughout your travels in the Congo, was there any close calls with gangs, or was there ever a time where you thought, or was there ever a time you feared for your life covering that, or was it smooth sailing?
Tell me a time when my hair was parted by the bullet. Yeah, there were several times when, dangerous people, unaccountable people are pulling weapons on you or threatening you. Or there was a gang of rebel soldiers in the east. Totally unaccountable people, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. There's no way anyone is going to stop these people if they choose to do something bad. Another time, I'm accused of being a spy. Another time, I was sicker than I ever have been. And I didn't understand, I had no idea, how do I get to medicine? How do I get to a doctor? There were no doctors for hundreds of miles. So I guess it comes in waves. For me, it's a bit like tinnitus, that ringing in your ears, that sound you get when you've been to a concert, the morning after, when your ears are absolutely just pinging. Something's wrong. The ringing is there, but it doesn't actually pick up to a deafening sound until you think about it, until you concentrate on it, if that makes any sense. And so the fear and the anxiety and the terror in the Congo was like that, a constant ringing in the ears at the back from the day I arrived on that particular trip to pretty much the day I left. Like 2 days before I left, someone stole my passport and tried to sell it back to me. And he was meant to be a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine, auctioning my passport back. He'd pulled a scam and said, you got to have a yellow fever certificate. Well, I had a yellow fever certificate. It's in my passport. So he took both, and he didn't return the yellow fever certificate. He auctioned back he just wanted to be a pain. He wanted to leverage money, and he was a friend.
Yeah, tough love.
So it was like tough love. It was like ringing in the ears. But as I say, for people in Ireland of a certain age, isn't it a phrase? Eat your greens, or you'll be got by the balubas. And the balubas were the Luba people. The baluba meaning the Luba people were these people who were fighting so fiercely down in Katanga, where the Irish soldiers were sent. So, weirdly, nothing's changed in 30, 40, 50, 60 years.
So to move on to your latest major piece of work, which is The Trigger, Hunting the Assassin Who Brought the World to War. It's a book about the teenage assassin who triggered the First World War. And what made you write about that period and subject? Was it similar enough to Blood River in relation to you being very intrigued and interested in the topic? Or did someone come to you and say, listen, you should write about this? Or how did the whole book and the idea come about?
No, very, very much the former. I've never had someone third party has come to me and said, I have this as an idea. I guess what it is this. I'm ignorant but curious. I'm challenged by things. The Congo, Central Africa, Africa's problems. I don't understand. I really don't. And I'm baffled and I'm blown away and I know they're important. It's important and I desperately want to understand. And so that journey was to try to better understand. The First World War, 2014, the anniversary is coming up. It still sits, it squats like an old, like Philip Larkin's toad on his shoulder. It's the toad on my shoulder, the conscience. I don't understand. The First World War, slaughter in the trenches, you know the iconography, we know the mud, we know the blood, we know the sacrifice. No one could possibly be brought up and not be aware of that framing. But the issue is, how do we end up there with European soldier against European soldier, supposedly civilized nation against civilized nation, toiling in the mud, scrapping through the earth? There's a great line in All Quiet on the Western Front by Maria von Remarque. He says, when the shells are coming in, and the shells do come in, if you've ever been shelled, it is not Hollywood. It is horror like you can't imagine. A piece of shrapnel the size of your fingernail can decapitate you, can disembowel you. And a 120 millimeter cannon mortar shell makes a lot of pieces of shrapnel the size of your fingernail. When that hell is happening, you hurl yourself to the ground, says Remarque, and Mother Nature, soil, the earth, is your only sanctuary, and you bury yourself into it. How could we have a 20th century empire, or empires, plural, the Kaiser's empire, the British Empire, where the soldiers are scrabbling in the mud? And, as a British person, no church I ever went into didn't have a memorial outside. No school service I went to didn't have some plaque on the wall. Here are the old boys of the school, old girls of the school who were killed, whatever. It just sits there. And I still don't understand where it came from, how it started, how it was triggered, how you end up with, Queen Victoria's grandchildren had a fight. The grandchildren, they were first cousins. The Kaiser, the Tsar, and the King. The British King, the German Kaiser, and the Russian Tsar were the grandchildren of the same doughty old woman, Queen Victoria. And they end up slaughtering each other. Yeah. Not 1 million, not 5 million, but 20, 25, 15 million. What a huge, no one needs to, everyone's familiar with those facts, but what I'm ignorant about is how we get that. And so my curiosity takes me on these journeys, and that's the similarity with the Blood River. It's an acknowledgement of ignorance and a driving curiosity that there are some journeys and some historical conundra that are worth working at, worth gnawing at. So, how did the First World War start? We all know from your history books that there was this bloke on a street corner in Sarajevo, and he shot the Archduke. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Habsburg dynasty, was shot by a Bosnian Serb student. And if you were very, very attentive in class, you might even remember his name, Gavrilo Princip. But who was he? And why does he knock our world off its normal orbit? How does he destroy the old imperial order? Because sure as anything, he shoots that gun and he doesn't intend it, but the unintended consequences of his actions are an end to the world order. I don't need to tell Irish people how important the First World War was to hastening the arrival of Home Rule, and that British imperial will, the empire lasts 1,000 years, all of that. That was all changed. The Russian Empire goes, the Ottoman Empire goes, the German Empire, the Kaiser, all of it is changed by a kid with a gun. And so that is what intrigues me. And so I go back to this space where he comes from, this Balkan space, and I explore. And there's a little bit of a segue here because, as you mentioned, I was a foreign correspondent. And back in the 1990s, I was a foreign correspondent in Bosnia. And I came across a funny thing in the city of Sarajevo when it was being shelled and when it was having such a terrible time at the hands of the Serbs in the 90s. I came across a small building. And that building had a cross on the roof, so it was a Christian building, but it had been hit by a shell, because a lot of the buildings had been shelled in those days in Sarajevo, and it turned out to be the tomb of Gavrilo Princip. Wow. So the guy who starts the First World War, his little tomb is in Sarajevo, it's been hit by a shell, and what do I find inside? People are using it, Richie, as a bathroom. The local citizens of this guy, this historic figure, this epic individual, He's been trivialized by events to such an extent they are crapping on his tomb. And so that just blew me away. Hold on, how does this kid? He's their most famous Bosnian ever. Why do Bosnians hate him? And then you start unraveling the layers, the cliche. You start taking the layers off the onion. And who was he? Yes, he was a Bosnian, but he's not. He's hated by these Bosnians because of this reason. Blah, blah, blah. And then you see how history filters things. And the journey I made was a wonderful physical journey. I went from this guy's birthplace right across the lands and ended up where he was educated in Belgrade and then ultimately on the street corner in Sarajevo. So it was a beautiful physical European journey. And believe you me, after my other African journeys, it was quite fun to go to places where there were houses with glasses in the window and shops that functioned. It was all rather brilliant and rather different. But the point was, the journey wasn't just a physical one. It was a journey through history, and it allows you to better understand how a teenager, he was just 19, he was a school leaver, wasn't even at university, just an angry teenager with a gun, could knock our world off its orbit. And that's what made it such a wonderful journey. I did enjoy that, and I enjoyed the archival exploration, the journey through the archives, finding his school reports. No other historians ever touched his school reports. No one ever bothered. They all looked in the wrong place, but I found the place in Sarajevo with a bit of luck and a bit of graft, and I find the guy's school reports, and you see in his school reports, I'm not sure what your
Best not mention
like
that, to be honest.
Richie, but mine, exactly. But you saw this guy going off the rails, and he's a bit like an angry teenager today, a jihadist sitting in an internet chat room, getting angry and getting on a bus and going to France and getting on a train and getting a flight to Turkey and then crossing the border into Syria. It's that sort of sense of anger. And you see that in black and white, an A student suddenly falling off the bandwagon and getting very radicalized. And that's where this comes from. And that's why history teaches us such an important thing, because, the young guys who are jihadists, who are taking horrific actions and falling in with extremist ideology and propaganda, they're not dissimilar to Gavrilo Princip 100 years ago. And we need to learn from the lessons of 100 years ago to try and stop the horrors of today.
And last question for you is, you haven't written a piece or a book in 3 or 4 years at this stage, or a bit longer. Do you see yourself actively writing another book in the future, or do you think you're done?
I hope not. I am working on a couple of book projects at the moment, and one is involving a jihadist. Actually, it's involving a young man who is taken hostage by jihadists in Africa, in Mali, and goes on a hell of a journey. And I see him as an important symbol for our modern world, where these influences, and since 9/11, every time America has come down hard in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Tunisia, Libya, wherever, Gabon recently, everywhere it goes, it fails to put the fire out. The fire just starts somewhere else. So that started 9/11, and we're now, 16, 17 years into George Bush's war on terror, and that war is not won. A lot of people are dying. And then there's another book project which is more academic, which is to do with the League of Nations. And you're quite right, I haven't written a book for 3 years now, 3 or 4 years, and I'm tying that into the League of Nations anniversary, which is 1920. So I've got a couple of years to go on that, and that is how the world was our modern world was created by a bunch of strange men with moustaches in a room in Paris. And it ties in with Irish nationalism, all nationalisms, and how noble the nationalist cause can be, but how that noble cause can easily be dragged off by extremists. And we see that today with Trumpian America, populism, and the Brexit issue on the other side of the Irish Sea from you, where we have little Englanders saying Yabu sucks to Brussels, you're not one of us, and they don't see the absurdity of their argument, that if they say Yabu sucks to them, then some other people are going to say Yabu sucks to them, to themselves, and they're not English enough, you're not Cornish enough, you're not Yorkshire enough, you're not London enough, you're not something enough, and suddenly the whole thing is reduced ad absurdum, to the absurd. And if the 20th century taught us nothing, or only one thing,
Yeah.
it just taught us that nationalism is highly toxic. And so I'm trying to deal with that in a book
Okay.
form.
So, lastly, what I do with each podcast is I just do a quick fire round to finish it off. So, first thing that pops into the brain, I
Okay.
encourage you to say, and if it's too incriminating, we can get rid of it. So, don't
Okay.
don't hold back. So, first question: what is your favorite film of all time?
Local hero.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Your favorite sports person of all time?
Daily Thompson.
Your favorite hobby?
Reading.
Your favorite music band?
The B-52s.
If you could pick a guest to come on
Actually, no, I'm
next.
going to change
Oh,
that. I'm going to change that to the undertones.
okay.
Same
If you could,
question, the undertones.
if you could pick a guest to come on next on the podcast, who'd it be?
He's dead. Patrick O'Brien.
Okay. Your favorite book ever? And it can't be one of your own.
Geek Love, Catherine Dunn.
Okay. And last but not least, describe yourself in 3 words.
Curious, ignorant, flatulent.
Okay. Well, that wraps it up, Tim. I want to thank you for coming on and taking your time out of your day, as I am swamped and housebound for the day and trapped for the foreseeable future. But I just want to thank you for coming on, and I really enjoy getting the insights of your work. And I wish you all the best with those 2 upcoming projects, and I hope they go well.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you to all your listeners. It was great fun. Enjoyed it
No
a lot.
worries. Thanks, Tim.
Cheers.